Hello everyone, this is Andrew. Welcome to Keen on America.
On July 4th, 2026, America will be 250 years old. An anniversary that will, no doubt, be greeted with a mixture of celebration, contemplation, and resignation. In Keen on America, Andrew talks not just about the American past and present, but also speculates on its future. What, Andrew asks, will be the 21st century fate of this now venerable American republic?
Hello everybody, it's Friday the 7th of March 2025 on the west coast of the United States. All is not good, it seems, with American science, or at least American scientists. They're demonstrating today against a lot of what they see are the cuts by the new administration. There's a movement called Stand Up for Science, which is drawing thousands of protesters around the country. Scientists are banding together. They feel that they have been punched in the gut by the new American president. One wonders what some historic Americans might think of this. Benjamin Franklin, in particular, perhaps the most scientific founding father. One book was written about him that identified him as the first scientific American. My guest today on the show is, in fact, the author of that book, Joyce Chaplin. She might be America's most distinguished authority on Franklin. She's also involved in editing his autobiography, and she has a new book out. It's out next week. It's called The Franklin Stove, an Unintended American Revolution. She is joining us from her office, not her office, her home in Cambridge, Massachusetts. She teaches at the history department at Harvard. Joyce, congratulations on the new book. Before we get to the book, I'm guessing that if Benjamin Franklin was around today, he'd probably be standing up for science, would he?
Agreed. I was at the Boston demonstration this morning. He was, of course, from Boston. And yes, what a decline from the 18th century when science was very firmly instantiated in public culture. The King, George III, did his own kind of scientific work. He had special equipment, including electrostatic equipment, telescope, some of which shows signs of actual use. So a tendency to think that science told you things that you couldn't find out from other realms and had authority and should be put into public life, definitely parts of the 18th century. And that seems to be kind of what's under attack at the moment.
As I said, you're the author of a book, very well-reviewed book, The First Scientific American. Is there something coincidental about the birth of the American Republic at a time of course, the Enlightenment and the great scientific revolution? Were they going on in parallel, or were they bound up with one another?
Definitely in parallel and occasionally connected. I would not say that the scientific revolution, for instance, explains the American Revolution or made it entirely possible, but there is very interesting public authority that Franklin and others get from their engagement with science that probably did help. Franklin was, mostly because of his electrical experiments, also his work with heat, an authority on science who was internationally renowned. And when the Continental Congress needs to send somebody to the court of Louis XVI to get assistance from France and recognition for the new American Republic, they pull out all the stops and send Benjamin Franklin, who is probably the most famous person from the Americas at that point in time. And it's precisely his expertise in science and his authority that made him as famous as he was and gave him a kind of recognition that none of the other founders or any other kind of envoy from the United States would have really had in Europe at that point. It's interesting that, therefore, it's science that gives the United States a kind of push, a boost when it really needs it. And that authority that Franklin has is distinctive in that historical moment.
Yeah, you might think of that boost metaphorically as the type that a midwife might give somebody giving birth, and the new republic popping out. It's interesting that you bring up Franklin's trip to
There we go.
Louis the 16th. I found an essay online today at, of all places, Christianity Today, comparing Franklin and Zelensky, saying, and of course implicitly or perhaps explicitly comparing Donald Trump with Louis the 16th, one of the more reactionary figures in European history. Is there any truth to that? Could we compare Zelensky and Franklin?
Well, in this incident, yes, because of the question that came up about what Zelensky was wearing, where he was berated for not wearing a business suit. He was wearing clothing that expressed where he's from and what he's doing. And the comparison here is to Franklin, who turns up at the French court wearing a kind of old suit. I mean, he did wear, that's a nicer suit than he was actually wearing.
Yeah, this is his Wikipedia page. I mean, of course, he didn't get to choose the photograph that they used. Maybe he had some other suits or less suits.
Yes. I mean, he was wearing kind of the lower middle class to middle class version of that. Whereas, of course, at the court of Versailles, people were dripping with jewels and very expensive cloth, finely tailored clothing. Franklin wore his old suit. He did not wear a powdered wig, which would have been standard at the time. And he was wearing his famous fur cap. And let me just add that a lot of people have described this as a coonskin cap. It was actually marten fur, gained from an earlier venture when Franklin went to Canada in a very cold season and needed to keep his head warm. And he takes that with him to Paris and decides it's a good thing to wear to distance himself from the nobility and to mark himself out as a different kind of person. This is often read as a Davy Coon style headgear. Actually, fur caps were the accoutrement of philosophers at this time. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has a famous painting with a fur cap. Several natural philosophers who ventured into cold areas were also had themselves painted wearing fur caps. So it indicated a kind of scientific, philosophic, and also extra-European identity. In that sense, the thing that Zelensky wore that's similar to that would be his black turtleneck, right? That indicates a kind of intellectual status, but it's not a suit and a tie, right? He is to be taken seriously for the things that he's doing and the things that he's thinking, but setting himself apart from politicians who don't have to deal with an emergency, as Franklin was doing at the court in Versailles, representing a nation that at that point was fighting for its very existence.
Joyce, maybe we can extend that analogy. Of course, the reason Zelensky wears the informal clothing is to remind people that his country is at war. In Franklin's focus or insistence on wearing, as you say, natural clothing that somehow reflects nature, a lot of your work in this current book, which we're going to talk about, The Franklin Stove, focuses on the environment and his appreciation and concern with nature globally, and particularly in the United States. Was he dressing down, so to speak, for nature, or is that the wrong way of thinking of it?
Dressing down for nature.
Dressing down in honor of nature, as opposed to the wearing the pompous and sort of I don't know if it's anti-natural or anti-nature clothing of Versailles.
I think he was making a statement about class in a certain way, how Americans were poorer and simpler. They were. and sort of embellishing that, not putting on the powdered wig, the very fancy clothing, and the makeup as well, which men wore at this time, to indicate that he wasn't even going to play the game, right? There's no point in going to Versailles in a kind of dowdy version of what all the aristocrats were wearing. You would look a little bit foolish. So he just doesn't do that. And he wears what he might have worn in London, to indicate that he was somebody from not the higher classes, somebody engaged in business, worried about the business and not how he looked. I'm not sure he was making a statement about nature, though the fur cap would indicate a kind of exposure to elements.
Yeah, that's what I was thinking. The cap might be the
Yeah.
giveaway. We can read too much into these things. Position Franklin in the pantheon of founding fathers. He can be compared and contrasted to a number of the other figures. I'm thinking in particular of Thomas Paine. I mean, he's not really an official founding father, but he was around at the time. And
Right.
Thomas Jefferson. Could you position Franklin somehow between these two figures? One part of the landowning elite, the other a political radical?
Yeah. I mean, Franklin, interestingly, was the oldest of the kind of canonical founders, older even than Tom Paine as well.
He was the wise man, right?
He was the wise man, but this also meant that he lived at a time in the early 18th century where he's been kind of associated with the radical Enlightenment, the kind of atheistical, vegetarian, teetotaling, non-conforming Enlightenment that really Tom Paine expresses a little bit. Thomas Jefferson, really not at all. He was a man, Jefferson, much more a man of the establishment. Whereas Franklin had a kind of wild youth, especially when he was in his first stint in London as an apprentice to two different printers, where he read every almost banned tract he could get his hands on. He learns about science and becomes a kind of disciple of Newton at that point. So he has this sort of more radical background that the younger founders don't really ever engage in to that extent. So it's paradoxical that the oldest of them all probably had the greatest exposure to the most radical ideas going at the time, which he shares to some extent with Paine, who he is kind of a patron to. He helps Paine when he arrives in Philadelphia, endorses him to a certain extent, and helps him get started on his political career or his career as a political writer. Franklin has very good relations with Jefferson, which may seem more surprising. I mean, in class terms, they are quite different. Jefferson and Franklin would have been very aware that Franklin began life as the youngest son of someone, a chandler in Boston, someone who made candles and soap from animal fat. And Thomas Jefferson comes from very different stock, where he and his immediate ancestors had never had to do anything practical to earn their living. They lived off the labor of others, quite literally, in the terms of the enslavement that Jefferson participates in all of his life. I think, Franklin isn't like a lot of the other founders. He famously is both friends. He's really a frenemy with John Adams. They have a kind of rivalry. But I think Franklin is very practical and strategic, and he's not going to pick a fight with these people who he thinks are his allies in making the nation exist. So he gets along with all of them pretty much. Whatever private feelings any of them might have had about each other.
Perhaps his most famous quote was after the Constitutional Convention of 1787, when he came out and someone asked him how they were doing and what came out of the convention. And he famously said, or supposedly said, "A republic if you can keep it." I never much, I mean, in the Wikipedia entry, Franklin is presented as a polymath, which of course he is, a political philosopher. I've never much thought of him as much of a political philosopher as a writer, a scientist, an inventor, a statesman. But what were his politics?
He was a monarchist for most of his life. And I emphasize that to indicate what he had to reject in order to become a revolutionary. So he was a subject of the British Empire, born in Boston, moves to Philadelphia. And for most of his life, he is obedient and conforming to that political system where Great Britain had a monarchy. The monarch was technically the head of all imperial territories. Now, Britain also had two houses of parliament, so there was a sense of a mixed government, despite the power that the king had. Nevertheless, Franklin accepted that was bona fide and accepted rule of law that he lived under, and that he rejected from 1776 onward, stating that the king and Parliament had invaded the rights and liberties of American colonists. So he is a revolutionary who would not have given a lot of indications that he was going to jump that way. And famously, he breaks with his own son, who remains loyal to the British Empire and to the king, indicating that Franklin really had decided not only to reject that form of government, but other people, including members of his family who stayed with the British Empire. So again, he's a radical, though this is not a steady feature necessarily of his life. Between the kind of wild acceptance of a lot of radical Enlightenment ideas in London in his youth and that 1776 break, he is a supporter of government as it was.
So in a sense, then, he would have been on the side of the Federalists, the authors of the Federalist Papers, as opposed to the radical Democrats who opposed federal government.
I don't know. He seems to lose a lot of inhibitions about what he's supporting toward the end of his life. So famously, he had owned enslaved people. He and his wife decide they don't want to do that anymore, and Franklin becomes the head of the Pennsylvania Society for Abolition, which that was a very radical position to take at that point. And again, rejecting more conformist parts of his life in a very important way. He also endorses Pennsylvania, which has within the new United States the most radical form of government, one representative house. All other of the colonies that became states had two houses, kind of modeled on Parliament, an upper and lower House of Lords, House of Commons style government. Pennsylvania decides it's going to have this radical one house experiment that doesn't last. But it is interesting that Franklin is associated with the government in the new United States that is the most experimental. So yes, after a life where, sometimes there are hints of that radical Franklin that peek out in various projects or statements that he makes, but he's mostly a team player until the American Revolution pushes, he thinks, too far, and he needs to make a more radical break with the British Empire.
Yeah, and actually, I didn't know any of that, but his argument, the example of Franklin can be used when people talk about Jefferson and slavery, saying, well, he was just a man of his times. Franklin was also a man of his times, and he chose to take a stand against slavery, which at least almost 250 years later seems self-evidently un-American, but I guess it's easy to say in the 2020s.
No, but very much. Thank you for making that point. Very much establishing that it was possible to rethink society as it had existed. And of course, anti-slavery was a very long-standing position, starting, of course, with enslaved Black people themselves, but eventually picked up by white abolitionists, and very much showing that the argument that things were accepted at certain periods of time, well, by whom?
You've been very patient, Joyce, in talking broadly about Franklin for people who are not familiar with him, including myself. As I said, you're the author of The First Scientific American. Now you have a new book out. It's about Franklin's stove, an unintended American revolution. So before we actually get to the stove, you've clearly dedicated a lot of your life to this guy. You must, if not love him, certainly be profoundly intrigued by him.
Well, I'm intrigued by him. I do not love him by any means.
But you don't hate him either.
I don't hate him, but I just saw a really interesting and good play about him called Franklin Land. That was one of the first kind of explorations of him as a complete narcissist. And I was just so grateful that other people recognized that this is somebody who, as a teenager, starts keeping an archive on himself. He wants to be famous. He really, really, really wants to be famous. No one does that unless they have big plans for themselves, right? He also wants people to like him. And these are both signs where he is seeking celebrity, and he wants to appeal to a lot of people and become famous to a lot of people. That's a tricky project, in fact, and points out how he has been self-cultivating for most of his life. So there is a way in which I would
That's
never
a nice
have wanted.
term. I've never heard that term before. Is that yours, or is that something that's thrown around at Harvard cocktail parties? Self-cultivating, Joyce.
Self-cultivating. Actually, that is an idea about the early modern period, that people were self-fashioning or self-cultivating and very precisely thinking of how they look to other people, kind of new idea. Adam Smith talks about this in The Wealth of Nations. How do you appear to other people?
Well, Rousseau sort of fathered the whole philosophy of this, didn't he?
Yeah, I think it comes from multiple sources. And Rousseau, interestingly, cares about what people think about him until he doesn't anymore, and he just breaks with them. So he has a very unsteady application of this theory. Franklin is pretty steadily, he's assiduous about doing this. But the thing is, he really wants to be famous, and he kind of has a career in which he collaborates with other people, including in his electrical experiments. I don't think people know that he did those with 3 other men, none of whom are household words the way he is. So he engages in a lot of projects. He does a lot of work, and he's the one who walks away with the reputation.
He's not lovable like Einstein. Maybe Einstein.
Well, I don't know whether Einstein was lovable. I have no opinion on. I'm not going to get into that.
But it's interesting the way you present him. Is that there's a sort of Trumpian or Muskian, given these two characters are in the sense that they're also obsessed with being loved and known, or doesn't he doesn't go that far, Franklin?
No, I will not compare him to Trump. I'm sorry. I do think, the thing that returns me to admiration of Franklin is what he accomplished. Anyone who's fumbled batteries into something where you have to get the plus and the minus in the right positions or they won't work, well, that's because Franklin defined electricity as one phenomenon with 2 manifestations, positive and negative. That's impressive that somebody 200, 300 years ago defined a property of the natural world that scientists still accept. He does a lot of very admirable, impressive things that prove that, when he was a kid deciding he wanted to be famous, he kind of realized that he had the ability to do that. And he uses that ability sometimes for other people. So indeed, being the head of the Pennsylvania Society for Abolition, chairing all those political committees, helping to set up all of these philanthropic works in Philadelphia, the hospital, the library, and so on. So I never would have wanted to have met him personally. I think he kind of made sure he was the center of attention. But the thing is, he was able to accomplish a lot with that enormous ego of his that was for the good of other people.
Yeah, interesting. A lot of the stories on the psychological stories on people who are eager for self-fashioning, present them as insecure. Why did he want to be so famous? Did he have a social chip on his shoulder, or he just thought he was a genius and wanted the world to know it?
That I can't explain. He's not a diary keeper. And his memoirs, his famous autobiography, he doesn't really talk about his interior mental states. And indeed, a lot of people's life writing during this period of time didn't go into that kind of more 19th century romantic era. And then I thought, and then I felt. That's not how he kind of confesses himself to other people. So, unless he kept a secret diary and it's going to turn up somewhere from when he was like 16 or 17 years old and embarking on this lifelong career of becoming well-known, famous, influential, powerful, I don't think we're ever going to really know how he schemed that out, why he originally thought about that. But he certainly did, and he was quite successful in terms of becoming famous and for lasting reasons that we're still remembering.
And maybe someone could invent that diary and create a musical around it. But you found Franklin in a different kind of way, in his stove. So tell us about this stove, Joyce. You noted earlier that you were a little bit sick of the guy. He was a bit perhaps self-regarding, wanted to be famous. So you wrote one book about him, but now you've come to this new book. So have you shifted from Benjamin Franklin to his stove? Is that the direction of your work over the last few years?
Well, I've got to say that I was convinced I was done with him. I'd written this book. I'd edited the autobiography. I'd done several shorter pieces about him. I thought that's plenty. Then for a completely different project, I was reading about a very bad winter during the Little Ice Age, 1740 to 1741. There were recurring bad winters during the Little Ice Age. This is a period of cooling that lasts from about 1300 to 1850. Noticeable on both sides of the Atlantic as well as outside the Atlantic worlds. And this bad winter of 1740 to 1741 was particularly bad. Among other things, it set up conditions where 13 to 20% of the population of Ireland died of famine. So I'm reading about this event, this very, very dramatic event, and thinking, I know those dates from somewhere, 1740 to 1741. And finally, I remembered that is when Franklin invents his first stove. So that was where I realized, there's something about climate change, the Little Ice Age, and fighting it, adapting to those conditions, improving human life as Franklin thought he was doing, by creating more indoor heat, artificial heat with less fuel. So this project, it seemed to me, was something, at first I thought, because I'd written this biography of Franklin and his life and science, I thought, oh my God, I missed a spot. And then I cheered myself up by thinking, well, maybe I can do a little essay about it, that would be interesting. And so I started doing the research, and it went on much further than an essay could accommodate. And that's where I found myself writing another book about Franklin, though with a very different cast than I or anyone else had used in order to recognize his addressing of climate change is a very serious problem. No one denied it at the time. And along the way, establishing himself as a climate scientist. So these seemed to be areas worth investigation, and there it is. That's how the book came about.
The subtitle of the book, Joyce, is An Unintended American Revolution. So what exactly was the revolution? Was it the invention of this stove, or a new way of addressing heat so that people could live through these terrible winters?
All of the above. So in some sense, what Franklin invents is not the stove. He actually invents 5 different stoves. So this is a project that takes up much of his life, half of the 18th century. But really what Franklin is inventing is the artificial atmosphere, meaning a room entirely heated through an artificial source. people had used fires, of course, to cook or to gather around to keep warm, Franklin thought that with the right kind of heating device and manipulation of airflow, really, you could heat an entire room. So ordinarily, I don't like that you can see the HVAC vent above my head, but in this instance, it is demonstration that we all inherit that kind of expectation. Interesting that this was done during a period of cooling when people might have been more fatalistic about what was going to happen, but Franklin and others established that this is the moment where they really need to rethink indoor heating and make it better. And so we live now in the artificial atmospheres that we inherit from them. Now, from his experiments with his stoves, the 5 different models that he makes, Franklin's also observing, well, how does heat move? And he emphasizes the principle of convection, that heated air will expand and rise. He uses that to manipulate how his stove can heat an entire room by using that process. From there, Franklin uses convection to explain the atmosphere outdoors. So he uses that to explain how storm systems move up the Atlantic coast, how the Gulf Stream operates. He eventually hypothesizes that volcanic effluvia, when a volcano blows all kinds of particles in the air, those can move across oceans and continents and eventually have a cooling effect. So he's using what he observed in these small indoor artificial atmospheres to explain the bigger one outside eventually. Hence, again, this way in which he's not only trying to come up with technical devices to adapt to climate change, but also to understand the climate itself.
Yeah, it's an astonishing achievement. Maybe he was right to think highly of himself. I mean, monarchs, I assume, had large fires and kept their palaces relatively warm. But was the Franklin stove a classic example of technological invention which democratized a young democracy in terms of people now being able to heat their houses without necessarily being rich or monarchs or very wealthy figures?
I'll just point out that actually monarchs suffered from the cold.
Oh, they did? Well, that's why they wore such thick coats, I assume.
Right. They needed the furs, right. There's a famous incident where the King of France is dining and his wine freezes. It's that cold. So not everyone, yes, you could bundle up, you could have access to fires, but cozy, entirely heated rooms, that is something the 18th century gives to us. And indeed, you're right that this is moving down the social scale. So Franklin was nowhere near as rich as any king. And it does seem that some people adopted his fireplace inserts or his stoves, who might not have been even as wealthy as he was. It's not entirely going down the social scale during his lifetime or even in the 19th century. So yes, it's becoming a reality for a lot more people and aspirational for others, but it's not universal. And I should point out that it required a great deal of expense to install and other kinds of material demands. So Franklin invents his first 2 of the 5 stoves to burn wood to conserve trees in Pennsylvania, but the last 3 stoves invented in Europe burn coal. That's, of course, a completely different decision, and here we are.
Yeah, you wrote an interesting piece about what Ben Franklin knew about climate change in 1740. Of course, the climate change back then was of not global warming, but of global cooling. What does that teach us about today, Joyce? What lesson does Franklin's stove give us in an age of global warming?
I mean, the central question in my book is, can you invent your way out of climate change? Which, of course, we're trying to do. And frankly, I hope at least some of those projects work. So we have an array of technical devices that are supposed to help us with this: electric vehicles, heat pumps, And then maybe even more ambitiously, geoengineering, putting something into the atmosphere to cool things down.
Carbon,
Carbon capture,
dumping carbon under the earth.
various schemes to get it out of the atmosphere. And these are all still fairly experimental. And I'm not sure we've worked out the balance between, well, what is mitigation, reducing carbon in the atmosphere and therefore cooling it back down, or adaptation. How are we going to protect ourselves against a rapidly heating planet? I don't think that the Franklin stove solved the little ice age, this earlier period. So we have that to think about, that yes, there was better heating. It was a good adaptation. The way in which it conserved fuel would probably not have kept up with consumer demand and certainly a growing population in the United States. So it's not sufficient as its own solution, and a warning against silver bullet thinking. Well, one thing is going to solve the problem all on its own. That's very simplistic. So that's one warning that I think comes out of the story.
Can we blame the Franklin stove for, in some ways, global warming? You mentioned that obviously it was wood and then coal, which contributed or contributes to today's environmental crisis. I mean, of course, you can't blame him, but is that one of the unintended consequences of the Franklin stove?
Certainly the new material demands of the emerging industrial revolution, which is the unintended one I'm referring to here, where greater comfort was promised to consumers. Well, how are they going to achieve that? They have to burn some kind of fuel, for instance, to keep warm. They might have other material demands. And certainly the shift into coal, to consuming fossil fuel, to replace wood, though the deforestation in terms of consuming wood earlier was a problem in and of itself. But this is an era in which people have expectations about being able to control the natural world, to intelligently use it, and to use it much more intensively. Hence the shift away from an organic or augmenting an organic energy regime dependent on wood, and using fossil fuels, first coal and eventually petroleum. Franklin's colony of Pennsylvania was really key to this history. Franklin has his stoves made in Pennsylvania using the early iron industry there. That's really the foundation for the later industrialization of Pennsylvania. Pennsylvania kind of becomes the heart of United States industrialization, especially in its excavation and use of coal and manufacturing of steel, the Keystone State. So there are a lot of ways in which Franklin participates in an emerging economy and encourages people to consider that economy as their friend and helpful to them, that lead us into an unintended industrial revolution reliant on fossil fuel and having created this climate of greater warming.
Joyce, you're not shy to express yourself when it comes to the climate crisis. I think you had an interesting piece about Harvard. It's time to address the climate crisis, perhaps divest of energy companies. If Franklin was around today, I know it's a bit of a dumb question, especially to ask a sophisticated historian like yourself, but if Franklin was around today, what would his position, do you think, be on the environment, on global warming?
Let me answer that, because I hate ventriloquizing him, believe it or not, even though I'm obviously using his story for us to think through in terms of what we might want to do now. But here's what's really distinctive about the little ice age, the era that Franklin was navigating and trying to get people to understand and to do something about. It's really quite striking that there is almost no denialism. No one said, oh no, it's not getting colder. Everyone was really worried that it was getting colder. And so Franklin's correspondence with friends or just scientific contacts, his Poor Richard's almanacs, his newspaper, the Pennsylvania Gazette, and reports of conversations that he had in the parlors that he's heating with his stoves. All of those show that people were talking about the little ice age. They were talking about a changing climate, their worries about it, their solutions for it. So the denialism is non-existent, really, as a cultural phenomenon. And instead, there's really kind of constant public engagement with what could be done, what technology might work. And that, I think, it's not what Franklin thought personally himself, but it's from his era that I think we have good prompts for, well, how do you navigate a period when physical meteorological conditions are not promising, denial of that, and refusal to engage with the material properties of that just aren't helpful.
I'm the last person in the world, Joyce, to defend the denialists when it comes to climate change. But isn't there a bit of a difference in Franklin's age? No one could blame how people lived for the Ice Age or the Little Ice Age. Whereas today, if it seems to me that a lot of the thinking behind denialism is a refusal to give up your big cars and your way of life. So it requires some compromise in lifestyle. Is that fair? I mean, it's much.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm guessing that some of the interpretation of the new Ice Age in a highly religious society may have had some sort of religious interpretation, but today things are different because it requires humans to actually sacrifice something.
Mm-hmm. I do think there's a religious similarity. There are people today who think that we are in the end times, and it is a kind of apocalyptic scenario, and there is a divine plan behind that. Therefore, interfering or inaction could be acceptable. I do think there was a theological, but a very interesting theological theory about the Little Ice Age. There was both theological and geological commentary on the possible physical consequences of Noah's flood. Right. So humans had sinned. God sent an enormous body of water from the center of the earth onto the surface, and that this had wrecked and destabilized the planet, right? That's how we have mountains and valleys in this sort of irregular, hard to traverse earth. It's also possible, people said, that this had changed the Earth's tilt relative to the sun and created bad conditions, including the Little Ice Age. So, among other things, this is an anthropogenic interpretation of climate change. It was human sin that caused that. People at the time, therefore, yes, and people at the time, therefore, thought, well, can we undo it? If humans did that in the ancient past, sinfully, could good human actions in the present offset that or change it? So a lot of settlers in North America, in British North America, thought, well, maybe if they take out the forests, right, that shade the earth and make it cooler, maybe by taking out all of those gloomy forests, they could warm up the climate. So they would take out wooded areas, open land to cultivation, and that would warm things up. In some sense, offsetting what ancient humans had done. This, in secular terms, was a theory that appealed to a lot of other people. So Thomas Jefferson endorsed this and said, yes, exactly. That's why we need to send settlers west, why they need to be armed with axes in order to modify North America and make it better for human habitation. Now, interestingly, Franklin was a skeptic. He said that not enough of North America had been deforested to really supply data that would be convincing. And that being the case, be careful, because settlers could either take out all the forests and make things way too hot, or they could take out the forests, therefore denying a fuel source for future generations, and yet conditions would remain cold. So, very interesting debates going on during Franklin's era about the human role in climate change, whether they could make it worse, whether they could make it better. It's not exactly the same as now. I'm not going to argue that this is identical. But again, the way in which earlier generations have faced what we're facing now come up with theories, devices, conclusions, arguments that maybe in some ways it might be useful for us to look
Now,
at.
there you have it. American history has always been about agency and God in one way or the other. It's no different today than it was in Benjamin Franklin's time. The Franklin Stove, An Unintended American Revolution by Joyce E. Chaplin from Harvard University. I think it's going to be one of those classic historical books that do or classic history books that do very well. When you put on your fire tonight, if it's a bit chilly, you need to thank Benjamin Franklin. I'm guessing, Joyce, no more books from you on Franklin. You're done now, right? That's it.
I really think I'm done.
Well, congratulations on this. Lovely to have you on the show, and best of luck with the book. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thanks so much.